Everyone, and welcome to the Tuesday, April 28th, 2020 Montgomery County Council meeting. And we're going to start off with a point of personal privilege, and we're going to hear from Councilmember Oliver Nas about his hero.
Thank you so much, Mr. Council President, and it makes me so happy we're doing this. Today, I want to recognize our hometown hero, Dr. Mike Greenberg. Mike is a cardiologist and provides training and care affiliated with the Washington Hospital Center, as well as Georgetown and GW hospitals. And before that, he practiced emergency medicine and disaster preparedness in New York City. He currently serves on the Commission for People with Disabilities, and he started a special needs advocacy coalition working with the Developmental Disability Administration and related state agencies to improve development disability service delivery. He also started an online communication forum with other advocates to help share ideas and support advocacy efforts. Dr. Greenberg says his proudest credential is that I am a parent of a young man with autism and advocate. As a secondary job, I'm also a physician. During this COVID crisis, Dr. Greenberg has stepped up in really, truly heroic ways. In addition to working long hours during his day job at hospitals, at night, he has gone home and has done incredible service projects, such as converting his garage to a mask making facility, and was able to produce hundreds of masks that he was able to provide to group homes and other developmental disability organizations early on in this crisis when PPE was so difficult to come by, and frankly still is. He also was able to produce bottles of sanitizer that he made at his home, and he has been developing YouTube training videos to get information out and guidance to families with family members who have developmental disabilities. Mike's caring commitment and expertise and leadership on developmental disability issues is why he is so trusted and respected within the community of providers and individuals and families. The way he has stepped up and provided guidance to these organizations and these families is truly remarkable. And in true Dr. Greenberg form, this was the quote he absolutely wanted me to share. That's really nice, but I'm not a hero. It's the individuals and staff in the home I worked with this weekend that are the heroes. I am very grateful for the vote of confidence, but every direct support professional working in these homes is a hero in my world. Dr. Mike Greenberg, thank you and your family for your dedication and your commitment, and I'm honored to honor you today.
Thank you, and that was very nice. And that's one thing you can say about heroes. Many times everyone else realizes they're a hero. They don't think of themselves that way at all, which truly makes them a hero. Thank you. Next, we're going to have announcements. And Madam Clerk, do we have any announcements or petitions?
Good morning. Am I unmuted now?
Yes,
Yes,
we can
okay.
hear you.
Thank you. We have not received any petitions. The council does have an addendum this morning, however. We've added to the consent calendar number 2D, special appropriation to the county government's FY20 operating budget, COVID-19 Human Services and Community Assistance non-departmental account, $750,000 for support for COVID-19 response, food assistance, feeding our families, source of funds, general fund reserves. Lead sponsor is the County Council. Public hearing action is tentatively scheduled for 4/30/20 at 1:30 p.m. That's April 30th, 2020 at 1:30 p.m. We've also added to the consent calendar 2E, introduction, special appropriation to the county government's FY20 operating budget, Department of Finance Economic Development Fund, support for COVID-19 response, $250,000 for telework assistance program, source of funds, general fund reserves. Lead sponsor is the County Council. Public hearing action is tentatively scheduled for April 30th, 2020 at 1:30 p.m. Finally, we've added on the consent calendar to F, introduction, special appropriation to the county government's FY20 operating budget, Department of Health and Human Services, $5 million for COVID-19 response, community assistance, non-departmental account, source of funds, general fund under undesignated reserves. Lead sponsor is Council President at the request of the County Executive. Public hearing action is tentatively scheduled for April 30th, 2020 at 1:30 p.m. That is all.
Thank you very much. The minutes have been distributed for March 3rd, 2020 and March 10th, 2020. And unless there is any corrections, they will be approved as received. And I see no hands. Okay. Okay. Councilmember Hucker, please.
Thank you, Mr. President, and good morning to everyone. Just a quick announcement I wanted to remind everybody. Today is Workers' Memorial Day, and it was previously announced of the passing of Michael Miller, who helped to direct our ride-on fleet in the Department of Transportation. There are so many other county employees and workers all across the county and the state and the country, first responders, healthcare workers, and so many others that are putting themselves at risk. And will be killed on the job. This is the day annually when we recognize and remember workers who are killed on the job each year, and we continue to press as part of a national campaign for safe conditions for workers. And I just wanted to recognize that today and help us remember the passing of Mr. Miller and any other county employees in particular and private sector workers that are being killed on the job, especially at this time. Thank you.
Thank you. Next item that we have is the consent calendar. Is there a motion?
So moved.
So moved.
Who was the first so moved? That was Tom. Council Vice President Hucker made the motion, and Councilmember Rice seconded it. And Councilmember Rice would like to speak.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. President. And I first want to thank all of my colleagues for their continued support when it comes to making sure that we can feed our families here in Montgomery County. It's one of those where we've seen the unique circumstances that many of our families have been put in. And it's very interesting because we always wanted to make sure we were doing our part to help those that were in need, those who were food insecure. But the reality is that number is now growing. That list continues to grow. Each and every day that unfortunately both our state and federal governments continue to extend the time in which people are actually getting unemployment benefits means that we have folks that continue to be more food insecure each and every day. The numbers are off the charts. And in fact, the number of people who are actually calling into our 311 centers and into some of our Manna food centers, as well as some of our other food providers, are off the charts in terms of those who require language assistance. And so that says something about where we need to focus our efforts. And so I was very happy to work in collaboration with Councilmember Navarro and Councilmember Albornoz in getting this first started. I really appreciate Councilmember Navarro and her impetus to make sure that when we saw this story of Megamart and the people that were wrapped around lines waiting in grocery stores, that we knew we needed to do something. And that's what this council does. We step up. And so we've put forward this appropriation today that continues to meet the need. I had said at the very onset when we laid out the first amount of money to Manna that we would come back to this, and we've had to. And so I just really want to, again, just thank my colleagues. You guys are awesome. You guys are amazing rock stars, and continue to keep putting forth what we know is going to make a difference in our communities. The key is that we have to be focused. And I really appreciate Councilmember Navarro's office, especially really honing in on some of the language that would allow us to be very focused in our efforts in terms of making sure that we're getting culturally appropriate food and that we're getting it out to the people who need it through a lot of the means in which we haven't been successful at getting some of that food out. And so just want to, again, thank everybody for their sponsorship, Mr. President, and I'll turn it back over to you. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Councilmember Navarro.
Thank you, Mr. President. Well, briefly, because I know everybody has seen this appropriation, and I want to thank Councilmember Rice for really illustrating what is the impetus behind this, and Councilmember Albornoz but really everyone, because again, we're once again acting as a council. It means that everybody is supporting these particular kinds of proposals. It goes without saying that, we are in a race against time, and the issue of food insecurity is just getting worse. I think that it's so important to capitalize on the fact that we do have a lot of ethnic grocery stores where we know there is that sense of familiarity. It's kind of like your neighborhood grocery store. And so they have agreed to step up and continue to work together with us. So I think this is a great way to pursue that. But I will reiterate that we need to continually keep in mind that folks who are low income, folks in our low income communities of color, immigrant communities are truly, truly suffering right now. And so this hopefully goes a long way to leverage some of this, but let's continue to understand that we're going to have to do more. But once again, I really appreciate you. Last night, Councilmember Reynoso and I were on a call with statewide Latino community leaders and elected officials. And I have to say, Montgomery County seems to be doing quite a bit, but it's still not enough. So I'm glad that we're working collaboratively to address these issues, and thank you for the support.
Thank you. Councilmember Albornoz.
Thank you, Mr. Council President. It really was a pleasure, as always, to work with Councilmember Navarro and Councilmember Rice on this effort, and all of you, as both stated. This has been an important collaborative approach. I want to acknowledge a couple of things. One, just our incredible Food Council and all of the member organizations that have stepped up. Montgomery County was uniquely positioned to help address this crisis. But as we are seeing it unfold, even that incredible infrastructure is being tested in ways that we never imagined. And this crisis is going to impact all of us in so many ways, already is emotionally, but we have a humanitarian crisis on our hands. And so everything that we can do to support our community and provide those essential and basic needs, such as food security, such as rental assistance, has never been more important than right now. And I also want to really thank our grocery stores and our restaurants that have stepped forward to provide assistance in many ways. One of the things I love about this particular proposal is that it's specifically targeted to leverage that support from our private sector and emphasize those ethnic grocery stores that are uniquely positioned to meet the needs of our multicultural community. So look forward to supporting this and what I'm sure will be more efforts moving forward to help our community during this crisis.
Thank you. Councilmember Friedson.
Thank you very much, Council President. Thank you to all colleagues for joining in support of the supplemental appropriation of the $250,000 for the teleworking expenses, allowing for the $2,500 grants to businesses and nonprofits that meet the same thresholds as the Fed grant program. There was a little bit of a discrepancy between the council's intent and the way that the bill was drafted and some of the ways that the administration interpreted it to require 50% losses for the telework grants, which was never the intention of the council. And so I'm pleased that all of us joined together. We didn't want this to be competing with the funding that we've already appropriated. We didn't want this to be caught up in some of the challenges that the administration has had with figuring out how to calculate the losses. And so to make this easier and simpler, we worked with the administration to come up with a program that was mirrored exactly on the FEG program, but a separate appropriation to make it as straightforward and simple as possible, to make sure that we can clarify some of the communications challenges with the businesses who have understandably been concerned about what the eligibility standards are that they are going to be judged on. So this will allow our local nonprofits and local businesses, as we had intended in our initial program, to be able to make modest investments in teleworking as we take on and continue the drastic but necessary social distancing requirements and the new normal that we are all facing. We want to make sure that our businesses can continue to compete and that our nonprofits can continue to provide the services that we are so desperate for them to provide. So very straightforward, very simple, the same standards as the FEG program, in terms of local businesses, and in terms of size of businesses, 100 employees or fewer. And this would make sure that there is separate, clear funding available without a onerous requirement like 50% losses for a modest $2,500 grant to pay for teleworking expenses. I'd also note that the state had a very successful teleworking program as well. Those funds have been extinguished, like all of the other funds in the state program. I hope that they'll step up as well, because just like all the other programs, we'll never be able to meet the full need, but this is a really important step in the right direction for those organizations who are moving forward and continuing with business, not as usual, but with business in our new normal. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Councilmember Jawando.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I also want to thank my colleagues for putting forward and all of us supporting the $750,000 for our food security work. As Councilmember Rice mentioned, this is the second time we've come back, but it most likely won't be the last. We know that there is deep need out here in our community. Over the last 2 weekends, I've partnered with one of our local churches and the Capital Area Food Bank to pass out over 1,000 boxes of groceries, and within an hour each time they're gone, and there's still people that need them, and there's multiple families, and people are giving families rides. There's 2-3 families in a car because someone doesn't have a car, and people are walking. We had 90 walkers this weekend, and who came up and carrying these 10-pound boxes back to their apartments. And so it just shows you the need that's out there, and we're going to need to do more. This is going to need to be a full community effort, as it already is, and that's why the Food Council is so great. I'm hoping we can continue to involve our private sector. I know we've had people reach out and say, how can I give money and how can I donate? I think that's a part of the solution too, as we go forward. I want to acknowledge the work that the governor has done, giving $4 million to the 2 main food banks in Maryland, the Capital Area Food Bank and the Maryland Food Bank. That's going to be critical money. We're going to step up and make sure that we, as we are right now, and do our part for that commitment. But we're going to need a long-term plan, and that's why it's so great that we have this Food Security Council, because we're going to have to look. This is going to be a year-long or more issue as people deal with the fallout of this economic crisis, in trying to make sure people have access to food. So I look forward to working with all of my colleagues. Really appreciative for the folks who took the lead on this initiative. But as you said, we're going to need to do a ton more and make sure that we're supplying for many other people. I do want to say that this Saturday, we're going to be at the East County Regional Services Center in Briggs Cheney if folks need food at 11 a.m. So that will be moved from White Oak to the East County Regional Service Center for the next 2 weekends. And again, that'll be 500 boxes of free groceries. And then finally, I want to highlight this council. We sent a letter last week to our federal and state delegation and our governor, urging more flexibility in our SNAP program, so that we can provide, so that restaurants can be involved and provide healthy meals, so that the maximum award can be lifted, and so that there is flexibility in the income requirements, because we know there's many people who didn't need food assistance before that need it now. So we're continuing to monitor this issue. I want to thank everyone who's worked on this, and look forward to continue to work to make sure that we can have a food secure community. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Councilmember Navarro.
Thank you, Mr. President. I forgot to mention, of course, that within that $750,000, there's $50,000 to help continue the strategic planning, the whole planning, which I think has been alluded to. This has to be a long-term solution. So we have included some funding so that our food council and other food providers can work on that. But I also wanted to highlight item 7, which is a supplemental appropriation of $5 million to HHS, again, for community assistance. This is building on what we had already adopted, the $6 million, and so important. Again, this is about emergency assistance to families who don't qualify for any other kind of relief support, and it is critical. What we're seeing in terms of the food insecurity is really the tip of the iceberg. There's just so much more going on in these particular areas of the county, and so I wanted to highlight that we are including this item, and that we need to definitely support it. And again, this may not even be enough, as we keep saying, because unfortunately, when it comes to these particular families, there is no other kind of help. So I'm really glad that we're supporting this and moving forward with this as well for those who are in such dire straits right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been moved by Council Vice President Hucker and seconded by Councilmember Rice that we approve our consent calendar. All those in favor, please raise your hand. And I see that is unanimous. Thank you very much. Next, we're going to go to the work session on the FY21 operating budget. Today is the first of 4 full days we have scheduled to review agency and department budgets. I want to remind my colleagues that we have agreed that this budget review would focus on same services, or what our staff more aptly called a continuity of service budget, continuity of services budget. This is by no means our typical budget review of each department. I am hoping that we will be able to have this more detailed review when the council returns to the budget this summer or fall. It will be difficult for us to complete this review if we are not disciplined in the number and length of comments we make on each item. Today, between capital and operating, we have 29 different areas we'll be discussing. So I ask my colleagues to please recognize that not each council member should speak on each budget item. Some points to keep in mind as we do our review. Our focus over the next 2 weeks will be on developing a budget that allows for the continuity of critical services. This interim measure should not be interpreted to indicate that government operations can continue into FY21 without little change, but that our real reductions will come when the county executive submits a savings plan early in FY21. Once we have more information regarding federal funding and revenue changes. Even with the continuity of services budget, we will be asking all agencies and departments to make every effort to limit expenditures during the rest of FY20, including freezing non-essential vacant positions and minimizing operating expenses, thereby serving as an informal savings plan for the rest of the fiscal year. If a council member believes there is a critical addition not included under a continuity of services budget, they can propose an addition to be considered when the council returns to the budget early in the fiscal year. At that point, we will know more about budget gaps and other potential reductions and can consider the additions at the same time. Alternatively, each council member who wants to suggest an addition to the continuity of services budget should also recommend a specific offsetting reduction. The council should identify and track any potential addition above continuity of services that is COVID-19 related and may be eligible for CARES Act funding. Those items should not be funded under the council until the council has discussed a strategic approach to allocating those funds. We will take a straw vote on each departmental agency budget, the same as occurring with the CIP. We are holding the week of May 11th for follow-up meetings if we are unable to complete our reviews on the current schedule. During that week, we will also discuss fiscal policy issues that need to be addressed. Thank you. The first item up is Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission, including the Park Police. And that would be, we're going to start off with Councilmember Reamer. I'm also involved because of the Park Police. And what I intend to do, so those are aware, I intend to ask our staff to go through the continuity of services budget first. And then if there's anything to add, that's when I'm going to jump in for my department, for under the public safety area. So with that, Councilmember Reamer.
Thank you, Council President. I think I'll just go right to the council staff and let Pam walk us through and Susan walk us through the budget recommendation. This was an area where the county executive's recommendation was just really impossible. They had many fixed costs, but unlike the county government, they don't have the ability to move as many pieces around in a puzzle to meet fixed costs and protect important priorities. So the executive's recommendation in the earlier budget, let alone in a time of austerity, in an earlier budget, left them with no funding for increases in important priority areas, and that would have really created a lot of issues. So I'm glad that the council staff has recognized this and has presented a recommendation for us that is consistent with our approach overall, which is going to be continuity of services. So with that.
Thank you. Ms. Dunn or Ms. Braun?
Pam, if you're on, you might be muted.
Yep. Am I video? Sorry about that. Okay. Good morning. Yes, as Councilmember Reamer noted, the budget that was recommended by the county executive for MNC PPC, their tax-supported operating budget, plus their non-tax supported items, was about $161.2 million. The FY20 MNC PPC approved budget was $158.3 million. So it was only a slight increase over their FY20 approved budget. And as you'll remember, council staff had a conversation with the council about how we would be approaching this term and this idea of a continuity of services budget, and provided a list of things that we should be looking at as things that would possibly be a change over FY20. But the FY20 approved budget really is the base budget that we are starting to work from. So for MNC PPC, it is starting with that $158.3 million approved FY20 budget. Compared to their requested budget, MNC PPC proposed $170.1 million budget for this coming fiscal year. And as you'll see in the staff report on page 2, the continuity of services budget, I worked many hours with the staff at MNC PPC, didn't agree on everything, but in a lot of items. And the continuity of services budget that I'm recommending is $164.6 million about that. And it is $3.4 million above the CE's, the county exec's recommended budget, but it does contain some very important things that need to be funded for a continuity of services to allow MNC PPC to provide their work program for the county. And included in that is pension and retirement, health insurance increase, OPEB, debt service. These items together all make up about $3 million. There are other things in there as well, and we can go through them in more detail. What this continuity of services budget also means is that it's about $5.5 million below what the agency requested. So there are going to be some things that they had wanted to do as new programs or new initiatives that given where we are right now with the fiscal outlook for the county, they're not going to be possible for right now. And as the council president mentioned, certainly there are things that can be revisited when we reopen the budget as soon as we get into the next fiscal year. The numbers, if people have questions. There is also a correction that needs to be made to the special revenue fund. Some funding for the maintenance of ball fields was left out. I think it was inadvertent in a comparison to the CIP budget, but they are unrelated items.
Pam, can you
talk about the work program for planning? So,
Pam, can you talk us through those items that will not be able to be funded based on this budget level?
So, the items that would be missing from the MNC PPC request, well, it's typical for the Planning and Parks Department. What they have done almost every year is when they get the county executive budget, you'll recall, it rarely funds what they request. So they go back through their entire budget process and they come up with a list of potential reductions to meet the county executive's budget. And they had done that again this year. They went through their budget and they said, okay, if we have to meet the county executive budget, what are the things that we would cut? And they put them into tiered lists for possible restoration. So they already have come up with it. In that process as well, what they do is they come up with savings. They look at places where when they created this budget months ago, They didn't know all of the information on costs for certain things, and they're able to take some savings that they don't put back on the restoration list. So in this $5.5 million continuity of services budget that does not meet their request, they have proposed some level of those cuts that they're willing to already take. There's also compensation increases that we're not including in a continuity of services budget. In addition to that, planning in FY20 had received over $1 million in professional service funding for consultants. You'll recall that in January of this year, they had a $300,000 supplemental for the I-270 corridor study. Those come out because those were really FY21 related new initiatives. They support specific master plans and specific projects and specific studies. And then we look again and say, well, for FY21, what are the new master plans? What are the new work program items that really are the core of the planning department's work program? And what do we need to fund here? Staff has included $320,000 of those studies. They support master plan work and they support communications, which is vital to the master plan work of the department. And other than that, staff did reduce some of their major known commitments slightly. Took out some funding that was for a reclassification study. What that meant was they reclassify internally their positions within both parks and planning. In that reclassification, some staff can get classified up. That means a salary increase. So there are costs associated with that. But as we're trying to freeze compensation right now or not have that discussion, I removed those. There's some seasonal benefits for seasonal staff, which again we think is probably going to be not as highly active as they might have been in previous summers. And then there was some increases for supplies and contractual obligations that was reduced.
Okay. Ms. Farag, did you, and I did want to mention that Police Chief Daryl McSwain is with us as well. I see him in the picture. Ms. Farag, did you want to continue the staff report, please?
Hi, good morning. It's Susan Farag with council staff. For the park police this year, there's a proposed budget of about $15 million and 114 work years. This is including 2 new police officer positions and about $24,000 in supplies and materials to provide security at the new Wheaton headquarters. The cost is offset by chargeback transferring the cost to the Wheaton headquarters internal services fund. The budget also includes about $8,000 for fair and impartial training initiatives for implicit bias. At this point, looking at a continuity of services, since the Wheaton headquarters is a new building and will need to be staffed for security purposes, council staff's recommending keeping these 2 new officer positions in the budget. Otherwise, security would still be provided and it would probably be backfilled with overtime.
Thank you very much. And I, too, am supportive of that. And obviously, when you have a new building, you need the security, especially in today's age. Councilmember Friedson, please.
Thank you, Council President. Thank you to Chair Reamer and to Ms. Dunn for the report and the recommendation. Thank you to Chief McSwain for everything that you and your team are doing. The Parks Police are really doing a terrific job in trying to balance the not being overly aggressive, but making sure that we are maintaining the health directives, which is not easy to do, particularly when a lot of the activities in our parks are really attractive to young people and to families. So I just wanted to thank you for that. I think that is a very tough balance to find, and every interaction that I have had has been demonstrated an admirable achievement of that balance. So thank you for your leadership, and please express my gratitude for that. You know, I think this is a really important budget. I mentioned earlier in the CIP discussion about the parks, about the fact that some of our most popular trails are up over 40%. The parks in general are up 40% in terms of usage based on data that we've seen that tracks based on cell phones. And it really reflects the fact that the parks are a big part of this crisis and making sure that our mental and physical well-being is being looked after. And so I really want to make sure that we are protecting that. I led the effort last year and fought really hard with a number of you and was really proud of this council unanimously coming together to restore really devastating cuts that I think would have had a severe impact on quality of life in the county. We are bearing the fruits of that success now because of the increased usage. I think this council deserves a lot of credit for that. I think that the county executive's proposed budget would have been similarly devastating. I think that the staff report and recommendation is certainly much better, and I'd obviously love to do more than that, but I appreciate the staff report and understand that the circumstances that we're in, and I think that in terms of parks and planning, parks are really about today and the future, and planning, I think, is the single most important aspect of how we move forward and get through this in terms of our economic development strategy moving forward. So we can't afford on either of these things not to invest as we must, recognizing that we're in difficult financial times. I did just want to raise, based on that and based on the unique uses of the parks and trails and the changing dynamics of the planning circumstances that may need to be adjusted, that we should provide some additional level of flexibility within the appropriation language to allow for some level of movement, because I think this year more than ever, that level of flexibility is going to be required in order to meet the growing demands and needs of our residents and to meet the moment with the economic development needs of our planning. So I just wanted to make a plug for that we provide some level of flexibility, and I hope that we can at least go with the staff report to make sure that we are funding adequately these significant needs for our quality of life and our economic development.
Thank you very much. I see no other speakers. This is a straw vote. Councilmember Reamer, did you want to make a motion?
Well, do we want to ask Chair Anderson for some comments, or you want to keep moving right through?
We really don't have that much time. If Chair Anderson wants to speak, please, but please, we're under a real time constraint.
We are very happy to accommodate the council's needs to have a continuity of services budget. We appreciate Pam's work with us in figuring out what that number is. And as Councilmember Reamer said, we just registered some flexibility in the resolution within that number to be able to manage to it.
Okay.
Thank you. I'll make a motion to approve the recommended level from the staff as outlined in the packet.
Second.
It's been moved by Councilmember Reamer, seconded by Councilmember Friedson. All those in favor, please raise your hand. And that is unanimous. Thank you very much. Police Chief McSwain, again, we didn't ask you to speak. And of course, if you would like to, you never tell the police that they can't, the police chief that he can't speak. But we do sincerely appreciate everything that you and your officers are doing. And we appreciate you all keeping us safe. If you would like to say a few words, you're certainly welcome to.
I simply thank you for the opportunity, and we certainly thank you all, the entire council also, for your leadership during these unprecedented times. We'll all get through this together, but just know that within the Park and Planning Commission, we'll be doing our part as well for the benefit of the community. And again, thank you all for your time and attention and efforts.
And thank you to all of the men and women in your department. Thank you. Next, we have Fire and Rescue, and Ms. Farag is going to lead us off with that, please.
For fire this year, the county executive's recommended budget is about $230 million. That represents a 2.8% increase over last year's approved budget. Council staff, for the purposes of maintaining a continuity of services budget, I am recommending a reduction of about $4 million, or a reduction of about 1.8% from what the county executive has recommended. I've got a list on your front page of items recommended for reduction that still maintain continuity of services. The first one is adding an Investigator 3 for internal affairs position. This is to address a backlog in internal affairs investigations cases. While it would be ideal to add this at this point, they can continue to investigate these types of cases going through FY21. The other is compensation adjustment, again, which the council will address at a later point. There's the increased cost for the volunteers negotiated agreement, and again, you will address that at a later time. The one I do want to spend a little bit of time on is addressing the 20 paramedic training positions that were added to the budget by the executive to decrease overtime. As the council knows, Fires had an ongoing structural overtime budget issue where it continually overspends its overtime each year. This dates back to, or it stems to a county stat report that indicated that fire needs an additional 180 firefighter positions in order to meet all services with permanent staff rather than relying on overtime. And of course, some mix of overtime is essential for this type of public safety function, which is staffed 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, but not necessarily to the degree that the department's been depending on. And this addition of the 20 paramedic positions would have gone a long way to help reduce overtime. Unfortunately, it represents an $840,000 increase for FY21, and we will not see results of how it helps to reduce overtime until FY22. So while it's not ideal, I am recommending that these not be approved as additional positions within the budget. As far as other items that have been added for continuity of services, there is a new item called Communications Contingency Plan for $68,000. Even though this is an add, I consider this the same services issue because this is the backup plan that helps fire deal with any disruptions to the current radio system that is undergoing replacement at this point. I do want to note that that's still on track for being replaced December 2020. So it has not experienced any material delays due to COVID and coronavirus public health orders. There are two items that are addressing small components of the fire's structural overtime issues, including adjusting recruit instruction overtime to reflect general wage adjustments and a civilian IT position that was added mid-fiscal 20. There are two items related to the emergency medical system's transport fees. Those fees are going to reflect a rate adjustment that aligns with charges under the Medicare reimbursement rate. This increase will require a Method 2 regulation change, and I've been told the executive expects to submit that to the council in May, and that will bring in some additional revenues. There is also an item that reflects the cost of purchasing a second set of volunteer equipment that's been added to the base budget rather than having the volunteers included in the collective bargaining agreement. I also have a list on the second page of my staff report that indicates potential items related to COVID-19 funding moving through into FY21. That includes ongoing COVID differential pay for first responders, any additional charges to purchase PPE, and additional cleaning costs for both the EMS units themselves and stations.
Thank you very much, Susan. As always, you did a wonderful job. I do see the fire chief, Chief Goldstein, is here. Chief, would you like to say a brief word or two?
As Susan outlined and does normally, the packet and her summary is very concise and very to the point to the components of the operational budget and the considerations to these topics. The nearly 3,000 folks of MCFRS are absolutely answering the calls every day to and in support of the folks in the community who are sickened by this pandemic and impacted as well by the pandemic. And we are committed and dedicated to be here for the residents of the county, and appreciate the support that the council and all of the folks in the executive branch are providing.
Thank you. Councilmember Navarro.
Chief, I just want to take this moment to thank you and thank all of your employees, are amazing, very courageous and dedicated firefighters, volunteer firefighters, all our EMS, everybody who's working so hard right now. Just want to say publicly, thank you. We know how trying this time is for them. We know that they're extraordinary professionals and very dedicated, but they're also human beings that are having to step up and also deal with the stress and the weariness of this time. So just know that we are thinking of them, praying for everyone, and we will continue to do everything we can to, of course, support them in this amazing work. But in my time here in the county, I know that this particular time is one that is just stretching everybody to the limit, and we so much appreciate everything that they're doing. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And Rachel from OMB, would you like to say something about the 20 positions?
Thank you. I just wanted to stress the critical importance of those 20 positions. We do recognize that it would be an additional cost in fiscal 21. But again, paramedic training and the paramedic resource at this point is critical as the county responds to the current health crisis.
Thank you, Ms. Silverman. And Chief, to Councilmember Navarro's point and all of our points, we sincerely appreciate all of our first responders, and we know that you all literally all are out there keeping all of us safe 24/7. And during any time that's important, during this crisis, it's especially important. Councilmember Reamer.
Thank you so much. Of course, I want to join my colleagues in thanking everyone in the department and our whole public safety team. I'll try not to lead a race for everyone to, feel that we all need to express this, but I think we all feel it. I wanted to just ask on the new positions to help offset overtime use. Are they not fiscally neutral?
Not during this year. Ms. Farag mentioned it.
My understanding is that it'll cost the $840,000 for FY21, but they will realize a net savings of several $100,000 moving into FY22. Just like they were given 20 new positions this year in FY20 at a cost, and we will start realizing that savings in FY21.
Right. So it takes some time for them to get into the schedule, essentially.
Right.
The circumstance is exactly as Mr. Katz just outlined, getting those folks on board and trained and then back out to the field. Adding 20 additional FTEs will not result in them graduating until July of next year based upon hiring and the recruit class 48 process. So the opportunity here, Susan outlined it, these positions are needed so that we can send incumbent personnel through the training academy to a roughly 9 to 10 month long paramedic training process. And this is an agreement with OMB and Fire Rescue that we would have 20 approved positions for paramedic training. And those spots would allow us to be budgeted for that level of training. Right now, we are doing that training. We had 30 folks in paramedic training prior to the COVID crisis, and due to the COVID situation, we had to stop that training and they went back to their station level assignments. But those folks, while they were in training for 9 months to 10 months continuous, they're being backfilled at the station level with overtime positions. So this is a point of budgeting allocation for those training spots and having what would become, as Susan outlines, reduction in unfunded overtime expenditures in the out years because these positions are allocated and already backfilled.
I guess I think we ought to come back to that because this year is going to be a lot better than next year. The year that we're budgeting for now, fiscally, I don't think there's any doubt is going to be we're going to have much more revenue to go around than next year. And if we can actually save money next year with an expenditure this year, that would make sense to me. If it actually doesn't, if it's, anyway, so Susan, again, you're saying from your analysis that adding positions now enables savings next year. I don't think we need to do this in real time right now, but I understand why this recommendation came to us because it was strictly according to the continuity of services model. But it seems to me that if we can actually get ahead of something here, and that'll help us when we're going to really be feeling the pain of a revenue decline, we ought to do that.
I believe it would be fair to say that as soon as we can come back, that would be one of the first things on the list. It does make sense. But I think we need to wait until either the summer or the fall when we can come back and actually discuss this.
Okay. Well, when I said come back, I was sort of saying maybe like next week or the week after. But
you can certainly suggest that. I believe that what we need to do, and Susan can certainly jump in, is wait until we can come back in the summer or fall. Susan, please.
My recommendation is a very conservative recommendation, not understanding what we really face as far as revenue projections go and adding 20 new positions. I absolutely agree with Councilmember Reamer that it will
reduce costs in FY22, and it is the first of my priorities to address if the council does return in the summer or fall to reassess the FY21 budget.
So I'm a little concerned about the timeline for our return. I think we're doing the right thing to do it this way, but it could very well be September before we have gone through another process, or maybe later. And so then I wonder, would we even have time to bring in a new class and realize those savings for 22?
If I can jump in here, I believe what the council may need to do if we don't get the budget back until if it doesn't come back till the fall, we may need to have we may need to do some special appropriations. So I don't want you to assume that if you're putting it on hold now, that there has to be an unknown delay. We will take items up one by one if they're critical, and I think this is a perfect example. So if for whatever reason the county executive doesn't get us new budget, or we're not ready to look at it, we can take up individual items as well. But I think, as the council president said, even by waiting a couple more months, we may have more information about our revenue picture, about federal funding that may help you make these choices.
All right, well, I'll follow up on this. I'm not prepared to give up on this one yet in this budget cycle, but it's coming up in real time here, and I know we have to keep moving. But I think we might want to think about coming back within this budget cycle to resolve this. If it just sounds like it's common sense to be penny wise, pound foolish, not to do that. Thank you.
Chief, would you like to speak to the recruiting in the class?
Sure, Mr. Katz. To Mr. Reamer's point, absolutely the timing of the fall is present. We have a 5 to 6 month window from the time we start the hiring process to the time they sit in the academy, through the 12 weeks of physical agility, mentoring, the background, the interview panel, as well as the medical clearance and the physical activities. So based upon our social distancing parameters that we're under now, we don't anticipate starting that until at least July at the earliest. So when we roll 5 or 6 months on that, we don't anticipate this class, no matter how big that class is, starting until January or maybe February, which is why we say these won't have an impact until FY22 by all means. So there's clearly an opportunity in September, October, as other folks at council and Ms. Michelson outlined, to decide and or do a supplemental that funds these positions.
Okay.
We won't be selecting the folks to go into recruit class 48 or a combination of recruit classes until very much the October, November, December timeframe. So we do have the time.
Great.
I think that answered your question.
Thank you.
And of course, the question becomes when you can actually have another recruit class. I mean, because of COVID-19, obviously the world has changed because of that. Councilmember Albornoz.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Chief, and your team, as everybody has stated. I guess the asterisk that we put in place for a same service budget, if it's related specifically to COVID-19 preparations. And I am concerned in seeing reports of other jurisdictions that are ahead of us in which frontline personnel have gotten sick or a member of their family has gotten sick, which has prevented them from being able to report to duty. At the height of this in New York City, I think a quarter of police officers and firefighters went down. And so, and I've also heard reports from our incredible volunteer firefighters that there has been a challenge in staffing those volunteer fire facilities for very legitimate reasons of volunteers having to take members of their own family into account or themselves. And so I do think that you can draw a straight line between the cadet class and adding capacity to helping to make sure, even if that cadet class is not available until much later this year, so that it prepares us, because by all accounts, this is going to roar back in the fall and the winter, and then coupled with the flu season, all bets may be off. And so I'm just curious as to whether or not there is any of the federal funds, not knowing very much about how that is allocated, that we might be able to access for this class, and then, you know, with the savings that we would get from the following fiscal year, help pay for it moving forward, but at least get it going, because I do think it's directly related to COVID response.
I think that is a wonderful suggestion and something we should look at. And, you know, we're going to be encouraging council members as we go through this budget exercise to be thinking about what additions are COVID related. And I do think this may be a possibility for federal funding. So we'll explore that further and get back to you on it.
Okay. And when you say get back to us, that would be next week or whatever?
Yeah, we will try and do that before you adopt this budget.
Okay, very good suggestion. I mean, there is a possibility this could be for COVID. No other council members are asking to speak. Is there a motion for this fire and rescue?
So moved.
It's been moved by Councilmember Reamer, seconded by Councilmember Vice President Hucker. All those in favor, please raise your hand. And that carries unanimously. Thank you very much. And we will, to Councilmember Albernaz's and other suggestions, get back to whether or not we can get some federal money involved in this as well. Next is Office of Emergency Management and Homeland Security. Mr. Levchenko, please.
Hello, President Katz. Can you hear me?
I can.
Great. The Office of Emergency Management budget, it's a small budget, although with a pretty broad reach, as we're seeing right now. It is composed of both a general fund component and a grant fund component. The grant fund piece, as reflected in the budget, is pretty stable, so I don't think we need to focus on that, other than to note that going forward, obviously, there could be some interesting changes in grants over the next year, especially if there's some redirection of funding towards the COVID issue. But apart from that, budgetarily, I don't think we need to focus on grants today. The general fund piece, though, does have a few items of interest to the council I think we will talk about today. The executive's recommendation on the general fund side was almost $2.3 million. And it's actually a substantial increase in this small budget, and I'll get into that in a minute. The council staff recommendation, which is based on the continuity of services approach, is about $1.44 million. The staff recommendation is about a 2.7% increase. The executive recommendation is about a 62% increase in the budget. Now, getting to the continuity of services budget and what would not be included in that, in the worksheet or the cover sheet for this item, I've noted several items. First and foremost is in the executive's recommendation, there was a item for new security grants to faith-based organizations at a total of $700,000. A similar program was approved by the council in November of 2018 and later implemented the following spring. But that was for lack of a better term, a one-time set of dollars. There was no building of that into the base of the budget. So the FY20 budget for emergency management and Homeland Security does not have that in its base. So from a continuity of services standpoint, this would be new funding for a new initiative. Two other items, or a couple other items I want to mention before we go back to these in particular. There's also a new position requested by the office, a new hydrologic expertise position to focus on a lot of the flooding issues that we're beginning to see with regard to climate change. So it's an issue of adaptation, which is an ever-rising issue, and we've had a lot of climate change planning work over the past year. So this would be supportive of that effort going forward. In addition, there are a couple of more minor staffing and between general fund and grant related issues. In a normal year, these are the kinds of issues where we would approve these for the department. It provides them some additional flexibility to utilize staff in different ways. But strictly speaking, from a continuity of services budget, these are additional, these are enhancements that the department would have. And then finally, the compensation adjustment, which you've heard previously in other departments and agencies, that's also presumed to be removed from the continuity of services budget. So all those elements together would reduce the executive's recommended budget by about $841,000, as noted on the first page of the cover sheet. The vast majority of those, as I mentioned, would be those security grants to faith-based organizations and that new hydrologic expertise position. With that, I'll turn it back to you, Council President, for any questions or discussion.
Thank you. I do see Dr. Stoddard, who's not the first time he's been at one of our meetings. Dr. Stoddard, you're on mute at this point. Did you have anything to add to the statement?
Just thank you very much for the support the County Council has provided throughout COVID-19. Obviously, that takes up all day, every day. I do, in the back of my mind, I am a bit nervous to think about all the other things that, we could face over the next year that would happen on top of COVID-19. I know that we are entering storm season, and we are entering, there is always a risk of other things, natural and man-made, that we have to be prepared for. And so we are, to the extent that we can, focusing duly on an incredible response that is COVID-19, while not keeping, while not blinding ourselves to the other things that we may face over the next year. So we want to make sure that we're staying aware of those things. We definitely appreciate council support in all the things that we're doing.
And thank you for all that you and everyone who's working on Homeland Security certainly does for all of us each and every day. Councilmember Friedson.
Thank you, Council President. I just want to echo the comments made about Dr. Stoddard during this incredibly difficult and unprecedented time. We get to hope for the best here at the council. You have to prepare for the worst. And every day now we have to think about the job that you do on a regular basis. And now we're living the scenarios on a daily basis, and realize that what you have been working towards and preparing for and practicing towards is happening in real time. And now we are part of what your regular life and professional world is like on a regular basis. And it's really provided me, and I think colleagues as well, with a window into the stress and challenge of the work that you and your team do every day. And so I wanted to reflect that and thank you for that on behalf of the entire community. I really do appreciate Mr. Lubchenco's report. I completely understand where he was coming from in the proposal to cut the $700,000 for security funding for religious-based institutions. I do think that we need to keep it in the budget. I sent a memo. I apologize for the tardiness of it. It came this morning. It's in your inbox to colleagues, so hopefully you've had a chance to quickly review it, but I will mention briefly what is in it. But the $700,000 for religious-based institution security grant funding is a continuation of the county's efforts that have continued in multiple iterations, most recently, as noted, in late 2018 as part of an effort to combat the rising tide of anti-Semitism, of racism, of hateful and bigoted violence and dangerous rhetoric and property damage against many religious institutions, even in our own community. It hasn't gone away. It's actually increased. In fact, as many of you have seen, there was a swastika painted on a synagogue very recently in Rockville, and this continues to be a massive challenge, threatening the security of these organizations, even as they aren't able to gather as they traditionally have previously. I worked closely with Rich Madalino and the county executive on this. I know others on the council did as well. I was very pleased to see that this funding was included to continue on this effort. And in light of the moment that we're in, I'd like to propose that we keep it in but adjust the appropriation, not just for religious-based institutions, but to broaden it and be more inclusive of it to reflect ethnic-based institutions as well, in light specifically of the fact that, unfortunately, based on some of the really divisive and disgusting rhetoric that we have heard around the COVID emergency, our Asian American Pacific Islander community has been unfairly and unreasonably targeted with a number of incidents in our community and throughout the country. And I believe that they should be eligible for this funding as well. I believe it's needed now more than ever. And I see this as a very important part of our COVID response in that regard, to stand up for that community and make sure that they recognize that we're here for them, and to continue on the efforts that we have historically focused on in Montgomery County from the previous council and administration into this one, which is to make sure that those in our community can attend activities free from fear and can exercise their faith free from fear. And that's what this $700,000 grant program is all about. And I really hope that we can continue it. As mentioned in the memo that I sent around, the email that I sent around, I've spoken with Senator Susan Lee and Delegate Lily Chi, who are very supportive, and also sent around a list, a very long list of Asian American Pacific Islander community leaders and community-based organizations that are in strong support of this appropriation, continuing the commitment that we have, but expanding it to reflect the current moment we're in and the COVID crisis that we face, and those unfortunate realities that have really seeped down from the national level, but have come to bear their ugly fruit, unfortunately, in our own community. So I will move to amend the staff recommendation to accept the $700,000 in the proposed county executive FY21 budget, with an expansion of the focus of the grants to extend to ethnic-based organizations along with religious-based organizations as well.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. Any discussion on this amendment? And I know Councilmember Alvarez, you're next, so I'll ask you in a second. You know, I just wanted to say for a moment that I've certainly had many conversations over the last couple of days. Councilmember Friedson and others, I had the conversation with him last night. I've been in support of these security grants from the very beginning, not just this grant, but for the very beginning. I think that it's something that's very necessary. It was something that we had to make certain that our community was safe and continues to be safe. And but $700,000 is a lot of money, especially when you're talking about a continuity of services budget. But I am very impressed by Councilmember Friedson's memo. I did get a moment to read it, though it was a fast moment. I mean, it did come in last minute, and I appreciate him doing it, and I appreciate his work on this. But I believe that I certainly agree that we need to broaden it. I certainly agree that we need to try to figure out how to do it. Maybe we can use some federal funds. I'm not 100% certain that that'll work, but if you don't ask, we certainly won't be getting them. So I think there's a lot of ways forward. Having said all that, I think it has to be underlined, $700,000 is a lot of money during this. It's a lot of money anytime. It's especially a lot of money right now, but I am supportive of it. Councilmember Alvarez, please.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Councilmember Friedson. I was, like all of you, deeply moved and troubled by what we heard during a town hall session from different faith-based organizations with what they were experiencing over the last 3 years and last year in particular. And this new normal, these awful, just racist and atrocious thoughts that have been under the surface are coming forward and really terrifying communities. And and this is obviously before COVID, and as Councilmember Friedson noted, since COVID, not only has this atrocious behavior continued, but it has actually increased. And specifically with regards to our Asian American community, I learned on a call last week with the Asian American Health Initiative that the calls to the crisis center from our Asian community have increased exponentially because of a lot of the rhetoric that we are seeing at the national level, which is playing itself out emotionally in a variety of ways, which is something that we're going to have to address from a mental health standpoint. But it also does bring to bear security issues as well. We have really remarkable Asian leadership in serving our community in so many ways. And this community in particular right now is vulnerable in a variety of ways. And so I think it's important that we keep the momentum going on this initiative, acknowledging, as the council president said, $700,000 is a lot of money in a tough budget year, no question. And there will be many difficult decisions that we have to make. But I think the broadening of it to include our ethnic community is important, particularly our Asian community. And that's why I am supportive of Councilmember Friedson's motion, knowing that there's going to be a lot of difficult decisions we're going to have to make in a variety of areas.
Thank you. Councilmember Rice.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. President, and thank you, Councilmember Friedson, for introducing this thought to us. I think that, again, I'm where the council president is, and I want to preface this by saying, earlier in this consent calendar, we just put forth $750,000 to feed families that were food insecure in the county. 750, and here we are with 700,000. Certainly for something that also puts people's mind at ease. First and foremost, we've always talked about housing and making sure that we can put food on the table, but certainly mental health and safety, public safety go hand in hand as well. I would like to understand, and so Marlene, you had said on the last initiative dealing with some of our thoughts around what we might be able to recoup from federal dollars when it comes to COVID response. If there's a way for us to do that for this as well, understanding that it's clear and documented in terms of the rhetoric that has been elicited not only from the very top of our federal government, but all the way through. This is something that we're just not experiencing just here in Montgomery County, but is certainly nationwide, and in fact, in some cases worldwide, as we've seen people who blame and continue to, espouse the words of describing the virus in a different way. And I won't even, grant them the pleasure of restating what they say. But those are the kinds of things that I think tie in directly to COVID response. So is there any thought, Marlene, in terms of that we may be able to get some of this covered from there, which would make me feel a little bit more comfortable as we're approaching this from a same services or a continuity of services budget?
Yeah, I'm absolutely fine with taking it back to the team and trying to determine whether this would be appropriate. It's a little bit less clear, but I think there's, maybe there's some potential. So we will explore it and get back to you. Okay.
All right. So, again, we all supported it from the beginning. So, it's not as if not any of us don't support it. It's just as we try and move forward with continuity of services, it's how do we adjust and make all of these things work in the context of, and so I'm in the same ilk. It's not something I'm going to vote against, but I'd much rather prefer that we do it in the context of COVID-19 response. So, Councilmember Friedson, I'm not sure if that's something that you can put in as a caveat for right now, that that's the focus. And then if we can't do it that way, then we come back and then say, okay, this is the way we'll do it, or something along those lines. I'm not sure what the right wording is. We're only taking straw votes today anyway, so I'm not sure that it matters anyway from that perspective. I'll leave that up to you, Mr. President, and to council staff.
Thank you very much. Councilmember Friedson.
Yeah, thank you, Councilmember Katz. I appreciate everything that everybody has said. I would be very uncomfortable if we didn't move forward unless we confirmed federal funding for this purpose, but I think we can move forward with the effort to refund it through federal funding, which is how we have handled every other aspect of the, as we've moved forward with federal funding, where we have put in caveat language to say that we will make every reasonable effort to recoup this funding through federal or state funding as available. And so I think I'd be more than happy to include that in the language. If I'm happy to amend my motion based off of that. I did also want to note, and I included this in the memo, I've identified $1.598 million in savings later on in this meeting. It is absolutely not a service reduction. It is reflective of a maintenance of service based on utilities and what we actually used this year. That is far more than the $700,000 that we've put in. That is very much in line with the way that we have set this up. I do believe that this is a continuity of service and a COVID-related expense based on how I have described it, but because I believe in belts and suspenders, I've also identified far more than sufficient the amount of cuts in order to secure the funding without having an overall impact. Obviously, council members would have to vote on that, but I can assure you that those have been identified, and I don't see a reason. This is a common occurrence that has happened in many previous budget cycles where the utilities portion of the DGS budget was cut to better reflect actual use. And in fact, I not only see it as a budget savings for later on, we'll discuss this more, but also reflecting our energy goals and our climate goals, and reflecting the fact that DGS has really made significant efforts to reduce the amount of energy footprint of our buildings. So I say that only to reflect the fact that I find this to be prudent to move forward, given the fact that those savings have been identified and I think are not a difficult vote or a particularly controversial vote to take place later on today. And I'm very hopeful that with the slight caveat from the council president and Councilmember Rice, which I appreciate, that we can move forward with the $700,000, expanding access and making sure that we're sending the message to our residents that we are doing everything that we can to keep them safe, and that we are focused on everybody in our community who are facing this rising tide of bigotry, hatred, xenophobia, and anti-Semitism.
Thank you. Councilmember Albornoz, are you okay with his amending the amendment?
I am.
Okay, thank you. Next is Councilmember Reamer.
Thank you. Great discussion. I certainly agree we should strive to have it funded through the federal dollars that are available, and perhaps groups could be asked to share relevant information in their application that would support that. Because I think the way it's been used in the past was, based on specific requests. We first approved this in 2018, as was mentioned, when I was council president, and I thought it was really an important step that people should be able to worship without the fear of being attacked and without the fear of violence. So that is certainly something that we stand for here in this county, and I think that in these times we need to really take every step that we can to provide that. But I think a way to potentially meet that, square the circle, would be just for organizations to help document that in their application materials. Thanks.
Thank you. Councilmember Glass.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to thank Councilmember Friedson for his leadership on this issue and this really good discussion, as has been noted. I appreciate Ms. Michelson saying that staff will take another look to figure out how to best use federal funding in order to accommodate this really important request. I agree. Here in Montgomery County, with 4 of the 10 most diverse communities in the country, we need to protect our diversity. We need to protect our religious plurality. And while this funding might have started a few years back to specifically protect members of the Jewish faith and Muslim faith, given some of the attacks that were put forth on them locally and nationally as well, we now know that the Asian community is coming under increased criticism and attack as well. Despicable language is being used in parts of the internet and in corners of the White House with regard to this current global pandemic and the libelous origins of where some speculate it comes from. And so we need to make sure that everybody feels safe and secure in our community. And as we're talking about this continuity budget, same services budget, we ultimately want to make sure that everybody feels safe and protected living here in Montgomery County. And I think that is what this will be used for, and I appreciate the expansion from some of the specific religious protections to some of the other ethnic protections as well, particularly given the current pandemic and the hateful, hurtful language that is being used in our community. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Navarro.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Councilmember Friedson, for bringing this up. I guess I have a couple of thoughts. One, I think it's really important that just in terms of the framework of the budget that we understand how we're proceeding, because it is very true that there are going to be items like this one, the previous item, that we can, make a straight connection to the issues we're facing with COVID-19. And therefore, we need to figure out, again, how do we leverage and take advantage of the federal funds? So process, I think it's going to be important just so that everybody's on the same page. I will also just, note that we do have a history on this council of, making these kinds of appropriations. Oftentimes it's been a little bit reactive when something has occurred, but we're constantly thinking about this. I think we all remember last year when we had a particular rally in front of the council building and the threats that were being made to our immigrant community. So this is not new. And I want to make sure, again, that as we move forward with trying to appropriate these funds related to COVID-19 or just related to the overall issues that we have faced, that we embody all of those kinds of instances. So, however we are going to do it in terms of process, I just want to have clarity. So, are we going to adopt certain things and then go back to see if it can be refunded? Or are we saying that we would, sort of park things in a list, if you will, to explore? I know we have that 183 million. I know the staff is working to figure out how that's going to work and then reconcile that. So just for clarity, because I'm sure there's going to be a lot of other items that are going to come up in our review with similar, consideration. But no doubt, I think that we have, as we have done, we'll continue to be supportive of protecting the right of our very diverse community to not only worship, but to also just, go about their daily lives without feeling the threat. Obviously, it's something that I feel very strongly about. But just for clarity, would like to understand process.
And thank you very much. As you know, we're sort of flying the plane as we're building it. So that is a very good question. Ms. Michelson, did you want to comment on that, or?
Yes. Yes. What I'm going to do is keep a running list of everything you identify that may be COVID related, and we'll come back to you before you wrap up the budget process to give you our determinations on it. And at that point, the council can have an opportunity to revisit those items and say, we want to fund them regardless of whether there's federal funding or we don't. So, and at the exact same time this week, you'll be receiving emails from me on the process for allocating the funding. I sent one out yesterday, another one this morning. So we're going to be doing both at the same time, but I will look at all of the items you identify and then bring them back to you.
Okay. Councilmember Jawando.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Councilmember Navarro and all my colleagues. But I had a similar question. My concern, we are fairly early in the budget process here, and there are going to be many things that I think there are going to have tangential, if not direct ties to the COVID-19 response. And I like the way we framed that you're going to kind of create I don't want to call it a reconciliation list, but a list of items that go on there that we think we would like to do, and that there might be a tie to COVID and then we'll look at it and come back. My issue, I'm 1,000% supportive of this funding and the expansion. I've worked on this issue as well, and particularly with our religious communities, our Muslim community, our Jewish community, participated in the great forum that you and Councilmember Friedson and Council President Katz and Councilmember Albanals pulled together, and very supportive of this, obviously as a civil rights lawyer as well, and we need to make sure people are safe. My concern is is how big that list gets of what goes on it and the amount of money. And are we able to, balance all these things that are needs that we need to do. And so is 700,000 the right amount and reflective of the crisis that we're in and the budget issue that we're dealing with? I know it's consistent with what we've done in the past, but so I'd be fine putting it on the list as yes, we want to do it. And let's check into the availability of federal funding. And then along with other things that are going to be on that list, coming like our firefighters and other things that we've made decisions, let's take a look at it once we have a better picture of the full list and how to proceed. So if that's what we're saying, I'm all in favor of that. I would be more hesitant if it was whatever comes up first, it's on the list, and everything else that comes on after is not. And so, but I don't think that was what Ms. Michelson described. So assuming I'm correct in my interpretation, I'm very supportive of the concept and expanding it, and appreciate the leadership of Councilmember Friedson and others to bring it forward.
Thank you. Councilmember Friedson, could you please clarify that was not exactly what your motion was?
No,
Please.
I just want to clarify. So the purpose that I'm saying here is I think we need to move forward with the $700,000 appropriation that we should include in the language trying to recoup federal funding if we can, which is consistent with everything else that we've done throughout this process, but not creating a federal funding reconciliation list and putting this on this list. The criteria that we set up for this budget process, this has nothing to do with what comes first and what comes last. You shouldn't be penalized for coming first either. Was threefold. One, continuity of service. Two, COVID related. Three, requiring a council member that's proposing funding something that isn't in continuity of service to find the savings. First of all, we choose what continuity of service is, not staff, respectfully. We're the council members. I appreciate the recommendation, but that's our determination. I believe that it is continuity of service because this is consistent with what we have been doing, with this type of grant funding, although I appreciate the interpretation that it's not because it's been on a more of an ad hoc basis than a base budget basis. But to me, that's more of a distinction without a difference in terms of operationalizing, budget actions. Number two, I believe that it is COVID related, as has been discussed, either of which would be part of our budget process. And number three, I've identified $1.6 million in savings later on in the budget. That is very straightforward, is consistent with the council has done in many previous years and has no impact on current services. In fact, it's reflective of the same services approach because it's based on the energy usage that we're projected to have this year. So the motion on the floor that I move, that has been seconded by Councilmember Albanaz, is to not accept the staff recommendation to cut $700,000 out of this budget, to include that grant funding, to add a more inclusive language to, than the county executive's proposal, to include ethnic-based organizations, with the friendly caveat of including in the budget language an effort to identify federal or state funding that can be used to refund all or part of the appropriation. That's the motion that's on the floor, and that is what I hope we will approve in light of the fact that it satisfies all three of the criteria that we had set up at the outset of this budget process, when only one of those criteria is necessary to meet in order for us to consider.
Mr. President, could I just reclaiming for 1 second? I understand the motion. Ms. Michelson, this is a straw vote anyway today, so it's not a final vote, to Mr. Rice's point. That information before the final budget, you'll be able to check on this and other items, whether they're going to potentially be able to use the federal funding. Is that correct? I thought I did hear that.
Yes, that is my goal. And, I will have to tell you, in some cases, we might have a clear answer. In some cases, it may be a little less certain, but we will be reviewing it, and we will be getting back to you on every single item that you identify that you think might be appropriate for federal funding.
Got it. So if this will go on that list, even if we approve it today, we can still come back. Okay, I'm fine with that. Thank you.
But just to be clear, we'd approve it. It would be part of this budget, and then we could choose to take it out if that's what people want.
Sure.
That's the motion that's on the floor. I just want everybody to understand what we're voting on. I understand where everybody's coming from. But if this motion passes, it would be included in this agency budget, and then we can reassess, just like everything else in the budget, we can reassess before we final approval, because it's just a straw.
Right. Thank you. Councilmember Rice.
So I'm a little bit confused. And so again, this is outside of this particular recommendation, but is something that Councilmember Friedson had stated a number of times, to which I don't recall us taking a vote on, saying that if in fact you find a certain amount of savings, I mean, because I could list 15 things today that I know that we're not spending money on that are savings, and then therefore do I claim them and now own and can increase the budget by X number of billions of dollars in terms of, I know we're not doing as much ride-on, so we're saving gas on our motor pool fleet, so therefore I can claim that money. I mean, let's just be very cautious about how we go down this rabbit hole of saying that savings that are owned by every single member of this council and the county executive, not just by one member, because they put it in a memo or put it in a note, that's a very dangerous precedent. And so and I'm not saying that you said that, Andrew, but that's how it came across to me. It came across, you've identified this savings, and so therefore you can use it to fund whatever things that you want to add in. And it doesn't work that way. That savings is owned by all of us. It's not savings that you created. It's not, and I'm not saying you said this. I'm just making sure that folks understand my perspective and my stance is that any cost savings that's gained by this county is owned by all of us, all 9 of us. And we have to collectively decide what it is that if we want to spend it or keep it for future use. So I never signed off on or voted on any kind of thing saying just because you put in a memo or sent it to someone that therefore it's allowed to offset whatever personally you want to add into the budget. That's not where I am. And so I just want to be very clear, Mr. President, if that's something that we're telling people or whatever, I'd like to have us have a conversation about that outside of this. It doesn't have to be here. It can be something that we do as a closed session because it's a topic that involves us in our operating procedures as a council. But I just want to be very clear about this because that's something that's very concerning to me as an individual who I know personally of millions and millions of dollars that we're saving on a number of things that we're not doing. But I haven't laid claim to any of that to say, oh, well, I want to use it to help to offset something that I know is important that I want to fund. So if I can get clarity on that, again, outside of here, you don't have to respond now, but I would really appreciate that because that's going to help us moving forward. Thank you.
I think we do need some clarity on that. Ms. Michelson, please. You're on mute. Marlene, you're there.
Yes, so the council president's memo on Thursday suggested that if people wanted to add above the continuity of services, one option was to identify offsetting savings. But it's my view, and I'll allow the council president to join, that the council as a body would have to agree with both the addition and the offsetting reduction. So you as a body would have to agree with, the puts and takes and how you want to use them.
Yeah, and I do believe that's fair. And of course, in this case, we're going to let Councilmember Friedson speak for Councilmember Friedson. But in this case, what he was suggesting and what I was suggesting in the memo that was sent or the note that was sent to everyone, that if we're going to try to keep to a continuity of services budget, which is difficult, if we're going to try to do that, then we have to try to, wherever there's that asset, we're going to need the liability. We're going to need the subtraction. So that's where I felt we should be. Councilmember Friedson.
Well, Mr. President, I'm not done. So understanding that, again, that's not owned by any individual council member in terms of savings. So again, if you're telling all 9 of us we need to start developing a list of all the savings and have my staff go through a whole bunch of savings to identify to just have on a list that I could refer to if I want to add something, that's going to be problematic. Again, something I don't think we need to talk about in this forum. I think that I have a lot of concerns, and I'd much rather us take this offline in terms of this specific conversation, because I think that it warrants some operating procedures that as a council, I'm very concerned about as well, that I'd like to address with all of my colleagues. So I'll put a pin in it. Everybody's free to talk as much as they want to, but I want to put a pin in this and come back to it in a separate forum, please.
And of course, mine was strictly a suggestion, and I still stand by my suggestion, but it's strictly a suggestion, and I believe that's something that we should consider. More than happy to have many chats with you, Councilmember, and I have a feeling we'll have many more than this one. Councilmember Friedson, please.
Yeah, I appreciate the concerns. I want to just clarify, because I am sufficiently confused as to the basis of the concerns. I simply was responding to the memo that was sent out by the council president of how he was intending to run the budget that he sent to all council members, and literally the introductory language that was used in terms of beginning this budget process that the council president clearly stated at the beginning of this meeting. None of these decisions are mine. That's why I'm making a motion. That's why it requires a vote of the 9 of us. The identified savings are not mine. The budget is not mine. None of any of this is any of ours. It's the public's. It's not even the body's, but the body has to decide on behalf of the public. All I did was reflect the fact that there were 3 main focus points for the way that this process was framed for us, both in a memo and in the introductory comments. And I tried to reflect as one individual council member proposing one individual action that based on those 3 criteria, I felt like this proposal reflected that process. That was the nature of my comments. That continues to be the nature of my proposal, and I continue to hope that we could have approval for it. And I just would point out, I think it would be great if every council member identified savings with their staff and proposed them, not because they're yours or mine or any of ours, but because we do need to identify savings, and I think that would be important. I would note I'm going to propose some other savings later on in the budget, including eliminating vacant positions, but I see those as more controversial than the one that I've mentioned here about utilities. And so I didn't mention that as the one-off, one-for-one trade, so to speak, that was part of the criteria that I put forward to colleagues for their consideration, because I think that will be a much more difficult decision point that we're going to have to discuss more thoroughly. And so that is the nature of the proposal before us. That is why I've introduced it and how I've introduced it. And I hope that I have clarified my comments to make sure that everyone understands that they were in keeping with both the spirit and the framework with which the council president introduced this budget process and set up this budget discussion.
And thank you. And I did want to point out that though this is a very different budget than we've had ever before, spending and savings are a vote by the full council. They're not by one individual. Councilmember Navarro, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. I agree with that comment you just made. This is a very special budget. It's very different. And so as we're trying to figure out this process, to me, I guess the way I understood it was that we would entertain the staff recommendations, of course, and I understand these are staff recommendations. Given the fact that we do have this $183 million, it seems to me that a more disciplined process would be that if we do identify items that we would like to fund outside of the recommendation, if we could park those in a list, I mean, we can come back, next week. And if there are savings that have been identified, we can also discuss those and, have them there as well. And even though we don't want to call it a reconciliation list, but at least it gives folks enough time. I think that to be doing this in real time, we can do it. There's no doubt, of course, 5 council members, we can make whatever decisions. My only worry is the discipline of the process, because, we just had the conversation about the fire class. We can make the same argument there. There's going to be so many other items like this. And so I just want to understand what is the most disciplined way for us to go through this. And it seems to me that an opportunity to digest, okay, these are the items that we all really care for. I support this item. I do. But again, I'm trying to figure out how if we're gonna be able to do this in a seamless way, we have to have some agreement. And to kind of have to make decisions on the fly and then consider cuts on the fly, it's going to be kind of rough. So I'm just trying to introduce a sense of discipline in the process. And, if we agree that the way we're going to do this is that if a council member has something that they want to add that the staff did not identify as continuity of services, that we're just going to say that without much time to even process, and then identify some savings on the fly as well. It just seems real messy to me. I would have preferred a disciplined process where if we do identify additional items, we do put that on the list. If we have identified offsets, we do that, and then we come together and only take up those items, and that we move forward. Just my 2 cents. Just trying to provide some discipline because, again, it's a very awkward position to be in. Obviously, I do support this. We're not just weighing things like, do we support it in the merit? We're weighing all these fiscal issues as well at the same time. So, anyway.
And I think that's a very fair statement. But I do want to make it clear that I think Councilmember Friedson was really following what he thought, what I, had suggested as the rules. I don't believe he really went outside of the lines on this one, not on every time, but on this one. Councilmember Reamer, please.
Thank you. This is a little bit confusing. I think the Council President's memo, was sort of a first step of trying to articulate a strategy. I interpreted it myself more narrowly, that if I wanted to add something in a specific area, I needed to find a savings in that specific area. But frankly, that's not what you wrote. I think it's also reasonable to interpret it in a different way. But having interpreted it that way, I felt like it was unlikely that I was going to be able to proceed on that basis. Kudos to Councilmember Friedson for approaching it differently. I think the reality is we're starting a reconciliation list. Unless what we're doing is essentially approving things that we don't review subsequently. That we say if we approve it now, it's basically going to be approved and we're not coming back to it. And I don't think that's what we want to do. It's going to be really hard for us to make that kind of determination as we go. Like, this is something we're not going to reconsider. So I just think as a practical reality, what do we have, but we're going to have to create a list. So I guess I want to put that back to the county council president, for some consideration. Generally speaking, I think that the idea that we would only put things onto a list if they are COVID related makes sense. I think that's a way to put some kind of strategy onto what we'd be doing. I'm still not quite clear on this funding, increase and whether we're saying it may be reimbursable. And so we would make a best effort, obviously by adding it, it's there regardless. And then if we're successful in getting a reimbursement, then, all the better. And then again, my only comment to that is we could structure the grant funds in a way that it is most helpful to getting reimbursement. I'm not immediately sure how to do that, but there is a kind of series of steps ahead of us from allocating funding to actually providing it. But again, it seems to me we can't really avoid creating a list, and so I think that's what we're doing now. But.
Well, thank you. First off, let me remind my colleagues: today is a day of straw votes. These are not final votes; these are straw votes, and there's a reason that we've always done that in a budget process, but especially this one. Secondly, to Ms. Michelson's point, we do have, I believe, May 11th to come back and discuss the items that are on this list. Ms. Michelson, did you want to comment on that? And then Councilmember Jawanda was after you.
Yes, and I'm very much appreciative of the fact that we are creating a new set of rules, which we sort of have to amend a little as we go. And we're working towards that. We did leave time the week of May 11th on the idea that there would be things that we'd have to come back to. And we were going to wait and see how the conversation unfolded and exactly what we needed to bring back to you. So clearly one item will be anything you've asked us to look at that's COVID related, and anything else that you feel needs additional consideration at a later time, we'll be happy to bring back to you. And to the extent you want to create a list of items you want to revisit, that's fine. I just want to ask the council to be very cautious in not doing what we would do in a typical reconciliation list where a lot of things are added, but would ask that you keep it very, very limited to really critical items where you are saying this, in your view, is continuity of services and not just something that would be nice to have. So exactly the way Councilmember Friedson described this item, which in his mind was a critical continuity of services addition. I think, you just have to be disciplined in the same way and not just add things that are, you might like to add. But with that said, the week of May 11th is the week we have left for any follow-up that's needed.
Thank you. And that is one of the reasons I attempted not to use the word reconciliation list, because I didn't want anyone to think that this was the same type of reconciliation list that we've had in the past. Councilmember Jawando, you've been very patient. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm told it's a virtue.
Yeah, I've been told that too. Yeah.
So that's helpful. I mean, what I was trying to suggest when I spoke was that there should be a list of sorts, you can call it reconciliation or not, particularly for COVID-related items. I think that should exist, and that should be parked there, and we should review that, and then we can come back and decide within the context of the larger budget. Okay, if it is great, then move it along. If not, then we have a much shorter list, hopefully, of things that we need to consider at the full budget. I would also I think it was a wise decision to go along with continuity of services and consider staff's recommendations and then come back with savings plan, which is kind of our overall budget picture, which I think is the smart approach. I think we need an ancillary approach to these COVID items for this list. And then obviously, if there are things that a council member feels very strongly about that they want to add that aren't COVID related or stretch that definition, that could be even a smaller list, to Marlene's point. But I do think doing this on the fly is putting us in a difficult situation, regardless of the merits of the issue. And I appreciate Councilmember Friedson's passion for this project and his ingenuity in recommending it the way he did. I think we would have had this discussion when we got to an item, no matter what. I just think this got caught up first because I don't think we were clear on. I know I wasn't clear on what the process was going to be. So I think I hope we can put this. My expectation is that we would put this as a COVID-related item on, agreeing that we should do it on that list, and then we will revisit that entire list if it's not taken off for some reason in context of the full budget. But that's what I'm expecting. Whether I'm going to vote for it as a straw vote, but I that's what I'm voting for. So I hope I'm right in what I'm in and how I'm articulating it.
Thank you, Councilmember Friedson.
Yeah, well, my ingenuity was following the rules. I just want to be very clear, and I'm a little uncomfortable here with the idea that we're being more disciplined by changing the process on the fly in the middle of a meeting. And I just want to be very clear about my discomfort, not just with the item itself, but with the notion that somehow I'm trying to do something differently than precisely what was put before us as the way in which this process was going to work. I am also concerned about the fact that the way that I'm hearing things, that we're completely ceding the determinations of whether something is COVID related or not, whether something is a continuity of service or not, to staff. And we were elected for a reason. I think we need to do our jobs, and our jobs mean that ultimately we make those determinations for what is COVID related what is continuity of service and what should and shouldn't be in the budget. I have great respect for the staff. We couldn't do our jobs without the staff, but ultimately we were elected to take the votes and we need to take them. And I'm going to keep my motion on the floor based on the process that we have for the reasons that I have already stated. And I think we should vote how people feel they need to vote and move forward with the process as we have. If there are changes to this process that we need to regroup, then I think we need to do a total reset. But I'm not comfortable with changing completely the process, creating rec lists that we're calling different names when we said we weren't going to have rec lists, changing the standards by which we were supposed to come forward with any changes to staff recommendation. I'm just very uncomfortable with that. And I think the most disciplined approach and the most reasonable approach and the most prudent approach is to follow the standards and the rules that we have set forth. And just to the one point about finding the savings within the same budget, that wasn't said because that wouldn't be, I don't think, a reasonable standard. I mean, some offices are tiny and some offices are massive, and so to require that wouldn't be reasonable. It's the same day that we're making the decision that I've identified the savings. There's a number of other savings that others can identify for other days as well. The point being that based on the staff recommendation, this would be revenue neutral, but ultimately it's not the staff's decision to decide how to fund the budget. It's our decision, and I think we need to take the votes.
Okay, thank you. Councilmember Navarro.
Thank you. I want to clarify because I don't know if the comment about calling it a reconciliation list was attributed to me. That's not what I said. What I said was some kind of process or mechanism where we would identify those items that we deem to be COVID-19 related that were not identified from the staff had not identified as continuity of operation. I know that when I first proposed the resolution that we all adopted, the idea was that we would, move as quickly as possible to adopt a budget that was based on continuity of operations, knowing that we would then focus all of our additions to COVID-19 related issues. And I think this is in line with what Councilmember Friedson is bringing forward. My only concern, I guess, is that it just wasn't, at least for me, and maybe it is for everybody, not for everybody, but for me, it just wasn't very clear how we would do that. How we would say, yeah, this is continuity of operations, but this additional piece is COVID-19 related, and therefore we're going to address that. And then, of course, because we're all kind of doing this in real time, then we had the information about the $183 million. So it was kind of like, okay, cool. So we have that, and how do we proceed? So again, I just want to be clear that I think that we are proceeding in the way that we envisioned when we approved that resolution. It's just going to be, I think, important for the council president and our staff to ensure that everybody is kind of on the same page in terms of how do we then make these kinds of proposals and how to articulate them so that we can, as much as possible, I know it's hard during this crazy time, at least proceed with a way that is coherent and that we don't, end up being all over the place. So I just want to say that, and Councilmember Friedson is absolutely right. I mean, the instruction that was sent is the instruction that was sent, and that's what he's, approaching. But I think moving forward, I think we need a little bit more clarity as to how we would then proceed, because we're going to get into some other massive areas. And I could argue that almost everything we could argue is COVID-19 related at this point. So, there's also that. So I just wanted to clarify those things. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Rice.
So Mr. President, just to close out, I think that we need to have a closed session. And so I'm formally requesting a closed session to talk about the process that we have in place, because one of the concerns I have from a structural standpoint, and again, one of the things that I stated at the very beginning, is the claiming of resources. You said something that struck me that said, well, we always have to find the savings. Well, you can't count savings twice, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, 6 times, and still have a balanced budget. So a person who claims that savings then claims that savings to offset whatever it is that they're doing. So if I claim ride-on savings, then now that ride-on savings is then spoken for and no one else can use it to help offset their initiative. So I think there's problematic things that are built into the proposal. I will just say this, that I never said, I've never said in public, nor to you, that I agreed with the process that you sent out on Thursday. We never had a chance to talk about it and never meet as a group until today. And so from that perspective, there hasn't even been any kind of opportunity for individuals to weigh in on what this process was. I did not understand it the way that it's been played out today. And so I still have issues. And so because of that, I can't support anything that goes along with the process that I myself did not understand nor did support, and say that I support us going in that direction. And so as a council member, as Councilmember Friedson say, as one who was elected to vote and make those kind of decisions, I'm not going to vote for something that I haven't approved as a process when we have a process that I don't agree with right now. So that's where I stand.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I don't know, and we'll have to double check whether we could have a closed session on this topic. We certainly could have an open session on this topic, and I would suggest that we have that. But I don't know that we can have a closed session on it. We will find out for certain. Councilmember Reamer.
Thanks. I think we're having an open session on it now, and that's fine. I think that's totally fine. This is all like completely, unavoidable. Well, it could have been. Well, anyway, it's fine. I don't quite see how a motion can be made that isn't. I don't see the distinction between supporting the motion, which is to fund something, and having a list. I don't see how we could do something today that we all agree we're not going to revisit. That seems to me what the maker of the motion is implying, but I could be wrong.
Can I clarify that?
Sure, please, yeah.
No, my motion is we'd be voting on this just like we vote on anything else as a straw vote. It still will be revisited before final approval of the budget. But we wouldn't be approving this office budget without it, putting it on a list, and then deciding later whether to put it in. The motion is to have it as part of the approved office budget. And then later on in the process, if there are any changes to this office budget as needed, and whether, if there are the appropriate and requisite number of votes in order to do that, then that would happen. But I've only been doing this for 1 year, but that's the way that the straw vote process.
My interpretation would be, tell me if you disagree, is that we would, let's say we all approve this straw vote recommendation. We then, in the next subsequent items, there are probably a few more. Then after we've approved all of the straw vote for the offices, we look at what we've done, and we identify the extent to which our ads have been offset by revenue, and we decide if we're going to go ahead and finally approve everything that has been added based on the revenue that we've identified, saved. That would seem to me to be a very straightforward process that is not terribly different from a reconciliation list. And I don't know how else we would do it unless we just agree that we're not necessarily trying to offset what we add. That's the alternative, is that we just decide as we go, we're not particularly concerned about whether we're offsetting what we add in the end. We're going to, we want council members to try to find savings, but we're going to add things as we go, and we're going to find savings as we go, and we're not necessarily needing to reconcile them all in the end. I do have to say I'm a little unclear on the need to reconcile things in the end. We are talking about continuity of services. We're not talking about balancing the budget, which we are also required to do. So maybe Marlene, you could help explain the distinction here. We do have to hit a number, but I guess, Marlene, can you talk to us about the revenue and expenditure match here? Are we going to be coming in under, and that's really the goal here, is we're trying to spend as little as possible to, allow more funding to be restored into the reserve, since we've been spending from the reserve for emergency needs?
Yeah, let me try and address some of this. First of all, we're hoping that most of the recent special appropriations that you have been made have been COVID related, and therefore they will be able to be refunded by the CARES Act funding. So we're hoping that that's kind of a simple thing to take care of. But there are a number of issues we're going to have to look at the end to reconcile this whole budget. And we're going to have to be coming back to you to look at the reserves and OPEB and some of these big picture issues to fit all this together. I'll just remind you that what we looked at was that the revenue loss by not implementing the tax increase asked for by the executive was somewhat similar to what you would save by doing a continuity of services budget. So we were trying to help you end up with a budget that could be sustained without that tax increase. I don't believe that there's any sort of extra dollars that will be available. Approving continuity of services will get you very, very close to that level. And again, we'll have to return and reconcile all of this and some of the big fiscal policy issues at the end.
Okay, again, I just want to say, I think we've created a list. I think every decision, I think this is a straw vote, and we're going to have to come back. So I don't think a council member needs to vote against this on the assumption that it's a decision that's essentially irreversible or won't be considered subsequently, because that puts a council member in a very tough spot. I'm voting now, and we're not coming back to this. I'm not comfortable not coming. I've been assuming that we're creating a list. That was my opening assumption, is that we're all trying to be very disciplined as to what we add, only related to continuity of services or COVID, but ultimately we're going to have to reconcile something somehow.
And that's fine. And as I say, I didn't want to call it a reconciliation list. And I do believe it should be noted, please, everyone go back and look at the memo that I had sent. And I asked everybody to weigh in. I didn't get any weighs until right now, but I asked everyone to weigh in. We're wrestling with what is a way to go forward with this budget. The fact that we started out with this one where it became the major discussion, in one respect, is a good thing, because that way we're clearing the air for the remainder of today and beyond. But that is what we came up with. That is what I felt was a way to go forward, and ask everybody to please weigh in. Councilmember Friedson.
Yeah, a couple of things. I didn't make the rules for this process. I tried my best to follow the rules. I read them beforehand. I processed them, and I tried to approach the budget accordingly. That's what happened. I'm not proposing something new here. I am simply proposing that the staff recommendation to cut something based on the idea of a continuity of services budget and COVID-related budget, I don't agree with. And I am proposing that we not accept that staff recommendation. And as the duly elected council members, I would hope that we ultimately are the ones who make these decisions, not staff members. And I've given the rationale why. And to add additional respect to the rules that have already been created and for the process that has been shared, and I also identified savings because I understand the fiscal constraints with which we find ourselves. I am kind of confused that this particular item that I believe is not controversial, and I share, I believe everybody supports it, has been caught up in frustration and concerns and misunderstandings about how the budget process is going to work. I'm disappointed by that because I think that there are real people at stake here, and the safety and security of organizations in our community, the interest of us in maintaining our commitment to keep community members safe, to address some of the anxiety and concerns and uncertainty related to these issues that we could send a message for here are at stake. And so I'm concerned that the broader questions and issues and confusion related to the budget process is catching this important issue. But I just want to be very clear, this is not my item. This is an item that was recommended to be cut by staff that I am moving that we not cut, as instead of accepting the staff recommendations. That has been seconded by Councilmember Albanaz. And number two, trying to follow the process as best as I can. If we're going to change the process, that's fine. I didn't set up the process. I'm just trying to follow it. And I hope that we, decide what we're going to do. But quite honestly, unless we stick to the process that was established as we went into this, I'm not sure what we do for this item and for the rest of this long day that we have before us to address different office budgets.
Thank you. Councilmember Reamer.
My question is to the council president. Is there a list? Are we adding things to a list?
I believe we've had that discussion several times today. This is a straw vote. This is what we are discussing. This is an amendment to a straw vote, which is what Councilmember Friedson, seconded by Councilmember Albernaz, have made the motion and seconded. So regardless, we're going to have a vote on this amendment, and then, just like any other straw vote, nothing is final. So therefore, it is fine. Nothing being final, there would be an additional vote at some point for the entire budget. As far as when Mrs. Michelson has said several times today, that as far as what she has said is that we will certainly look at things on May 11th, which is 2 weeks, I guess, to when we have the entire discussion. She will, in the meantime, her staff will be looking at whether or not these could be COVID related. There's some question whether it could be. There is some question whether it couldn't be. But they will look into that. And at that point, we will certainly be more than having another discussion on what we will and won't do. But this vote, the way this amendment has been set forth and been repeated several times in the last hour or so, is that this is an amendment for the $700,000, and that if possible, we will see if we can get some additional funding for this, or some funding for this through the federal COVID money that's available. But this is not contingent upon that, the way that this amendment has been made.
Okay, well, I feel the need then subsequently to establish a sense of the council that any addition to any budget above the staff recommendation or any change will be added to a list. I don't see why we wouldn't do that.
If I can just jump in with something that may help, we will be tracking the budget as we always do. Yeah. So we will be sending out a tracking report that shows all the additions and all of the reductions you make. It'll just be a tracking report, won't have a name, and that always provides you with the ability to look back on any decisions and hopefully can simplify your means of identifying what you might want to reconsider.
Okay, so you will be tracking all of these items, and then we'll come back later and we'll decide if we need to do anything additional. I mean, that is also consistent with taking a straw vote. I mean, I just don't think it's true that the implication is we won't reconsider something. It's a straw vote. It's a straw vote. It's not a vote unless it's a vote. It's a straw vote. So I support the motion. I also want to ensure that we are able to fund a wide array of priorities, including the same organizations that are requesting security assistance are going to be requesting food assistance. You know, we have to ensure that we have funding across all of the needs, and we have to make sure that we can reconcile everything in the end. So that's what I'm voting to do.
Okay. Let me just take one moment, and then we're going to keep going. But I wanted to read numbers 4 and 5 in the memo that I had sent. And it says, I proposed that the council not, the word not was in all capital letters, increase the budget above a continuity of services budget or develop a reconciliation list to be considered before we adopt the budget in May. Instead, if council members believe there are critical additions, they should be identified and considered when the council reconsiders the budget early in FY21. At this point, we will know more about budget gaps and other potential reductions and can consider the additions at the same time. Alternatively, each council member who wants to suggest an addition to the continuity of services budget should also recommend a specific offsetting reduction. And number 5 on this list of 7 was the council should identify and track any potential addition above continuity of services that is COVID-19 related and may be eligible for the CARES Act funding. Those items should not be added to the budget until we receive the federal money and have discussed a strategic approach to allocating these funds. That was my suggestion. That was not something that was anything beyond that.
Okay, well, that's that's very important because we have not really clarified in the moment whether these funds are in the bucket that is going to be based on the COVID reimbursement.
According to the motion, and Councilmember Friedson is still sitting here, and he will correct me if I'm wrong, when I'm wrong, but according to this motion, he is not suggesting that this would be necessarily COVID related. He is saying that if it is, we should certainly try to get those funds. And I'm getting a head shake from that. Councilmember Joando, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. So I'm glad you reread that. I mean, so in the first case, we took up the firefighters. We took the parks budget. We moved past that. We took up the firefighters budget and adhered to the first thing that you read, which was we all think we should add it, but we're not going to add it at this time because we're going to, per your memo, which again, Craig's point, Councilman Rice's point, we didn't agree as a body to that process. So, and I know we're moving in real time, so I don't blame you for that. But assuming for a second that we did all agree to that process, for the fire department, we were in the category of, okay, we think it might be COVID related, so we are not going to add it at this point, per your recommendation, but we are going to come back to it once we confirm that it is COVID related. So that was that category.
Yeah.
Now we're in, Councilmember Friedson has moved to the alternatively part of your memo, where regardless, he's saying whether it's COVID related or not, which it might be, I want to add it in right now to create the affirmative sense that it's in the budget, even if it's a straw vote, and then we will have to then take it out, which is a problem for me. I don't think we should operate in that way on a set of procedures that we haven't agreed upon. Agreeing that he did it, what was said in the memo. So I don't have a problem with that. I just think that the first case in the firefighters, which is very important as well, we said, no, we're going to do the continuity of services. We're going to go through this budget. That's why we have 30 items on this list, because we thought we were going to fly through this, not add things, and then come back later in July and summer or after we have this COVID list. If we go this route on this motion, we're going to be here all day adding things and going back and forth. So that's just my concern on this. I am, again, supportive of the idea, but we must have a list. Otherwise, it's just not going to work, in my view. So, I don't know if we need to, the sense of if we move past this and then we pass something, but I almost think we should, decide the process before we go forward with this type of motion. So I want to appeal to Councilmember Friedson if we could either table this or decide the process before we make this vote, because I think it's significant and it could set a course for something that none of us want, where we're going to be adding things and it's going to be the Wild West.
If we continue to have these discussions on all the topics that we have, we will be here until May 11th. It's just straightforward. We're not, this has taken hours and for good reason, but that is what we are. So I'm asking Councilmember Friedson, you have a question from Councilmember Joando.
Well, if we're going to table this, I think we just have to table every single conversation for the rest of the day. That's my concern. We had a process. I'm trying my best to follow the process. I'm not sure how to move forward with any other conversation we had. I want to be clear as well. A couple things. If I had set this process how I wanted to do it, I would have done the big budget decisions at the beginning. I've had multiple conversations with Ms. Michelson and Councilman. That would be my preference. The idea that we're reconciling off of something, we have nothing with which to reconcile. We haven't decided a target number of savings that we need to find in order to accomplish what we've determined is same services budget. We haven't made big decisions on contracts yet. We haven't made big decisions on the taxes yet, although we've signaled that. We haven't actually formally voted on that. I mean, there are major decisions that we have not made. This is the approach that was chosen, and I respect process. This is the process that was put forward. But I have a real concern, based on what I'm hearing, that council members don't even have the ability to disagree with a recommendation made forward by a staff member of what is or isn't same services.
I agree with you on that point, Andrew.
I mean, that's crazy.
I agree with you on that.
To me, again, I have great deal of respect for the staff, but all I am proposing is that I don't agree with a staff recommendation to cut something that I believe falls in line with what I believe we have set forward. So all I'm saying is we should include that. The idea that I have to, that this is some huge, personal privilege that I have presented is just baffling and confusing to me.
If I could just reclaim for 1 second, I actually agree with you. You should have every right, and every council member should have every right to propose what they want to propose. All I'm saying, and I think what I'm hearing from Councilmember Reamer and Rice and Navarro and at least those four, is that if you propose it, it should be put on a list to be considered, and it should not be presumptively considered to be in the budget that we have to then remove it, because that creates an expectation with the public that it was in and then we took it out. And I just don't think that's fair. And I realize with the straw vote, we will consider everything, but we have to be able to consider that in the list. I think every council member should say, I think this is a priority and we should put it in and it should go on list. And then we should, as a body, consider that list. And we should use restraint in what we put on that list. That's all I'm saying.
I appreciate that. I think I have used restraint. I found far more savings than was available. It is beyond what was recommended by staff in this. That is exactly what we were asked to do. I am proposing a much more significant cut to an area of the budget that doesn't impact services, that would allow for this to happen. And I'm not proposing a new program, which I think would be inappropriate. I'm proposing to not accept a cut because I have a philosophical disagreement with what this is and what this isn't, and the need for it based on how we're moving forward. So that the presumption that concerns me, and I think we agree on this, but the presumption that concerns me is that the staff recommendation becomes the budget. Like the staff has now become the county executive in the charter based on the way that I'm being told that this is going to move forward. And that makes me deeply uncomfortable, that we have to make formal decisions off of the staff recommendation. And if the staff recommends cutting something and we don't agree with the cut, or the staff recommends doing something and we don't agree with that we're operating exclusively off of what the staff has recommended for our consideration. My view of this is there is nothing that has happened until the council takes a straw vote. It doesn't mean that's a final decision. It doesn't mean that there can't be changes to it, but literally all we have is an analysis from a staff member who has worked very hard and I think made very thoughtful recommendations. I happen to have a disagreement. Sounds like Councilmember Alvarez shares that disagreement. Some others might share it as well. There might be concerns with what the implications, some might agree. I don't know, but that's all I'm saying here. And so I have a little bit of a concern with saying you have to put something on a list because you disagreed with a staff member. My view is that decision has been made. If this was something new, then I could agree with it. And if we had a dollar amount target that each budget needed to find, let's say we decided a same services budget meant 4% across the board cuts. So every department had to find 4% in cuts. And so the staff member came up with a recommendation for 4%, and we didn't agree with the 4%. We made the rule of 4% as a council because it's our decision, not the staff member who recommends. Then it would be the obligation of an individual council member to convince enough colleagues to find that 4% somewhere else. I would have preferred that process. That's not the way that we have set up this process. And so what I'm saying is we shouldn't be treating the recommendation of a staff member and rejecting that recommendation
as the county executive's budget.
As the county executive's budget, because now there would be no distinction between the county executive not funding something and a council member creating a new program as council members disagreeing with a recommendation to not cut something. And to me, that's fundamentally flawed, and that violates the spirit of what the charter has set up the process to be.
And we shouldn't have the cross conversation, please. We need to.
I thought I asked a question that was being responded to, and then
you yielded to me. I'm yielding back. Sorry.
Yeah, I appreciate it. And I'll just say, I agree with you on the responsibility of us as council members to make decisions and how we deal with staff recommendations. You know how I feel about that in general, but I think this is an unprecedented, different situation, right? We're in a situation where we're trying to do it on the fly. We don't know exactly what the savings are going to be. I think the council president rightly, the approach was, and Councilmember Navarro laid out this too, continuity services. Let's not make any big decisions before we know exactly what revenue is going to look like to the best of our ability, the federal decisions. And so I would just, again, ask if we could amend your motion to add that this would go on a list that we would then all consider as a body, not staff, as a body. That would make me feel better. I think that's going to functionally happen either way. I just think it would be unfair to the groups that rightly want this to go forward, and we all agree with the substance, to say that, hey, it's in the budget and we're going to have to take it out now. That's the problem I have, but I yield back, and I defer to the council president on how he wants to proceed.
Thank you. Councilmember Navarro.
Thank you. Also just want to say that, to Councilmember Friedson, don't think that this is particularly targeted at you or your proposal, because it is one that I think we all agree upon. I think it would have happened anyway with this is just the first one, right? But in terms of process, again, I think we all agree on this particular item. Once again, I think it's just a process. Even if we were to, for example, follow what was said in the memo about alternatively, to agree to include something, but then later on have to come back to agree on the proposed cuts, to me also seems odd, because what if we don't agree on those cuts, And so I think it's just that issue of the process that to me just seems off. And again, I maybe also had interpreted incorrectly that we would have a running list of sorts, and then we would consider all the cuts, and then, we would say, hey, cool, everything is fine. Or if there's a gap between the cuts that we identified and the things that we included on the so-called list, if you will, then we would have to address that. But right now, just logically and mathematically, I'm just having a rough time figuring out, we approve this, we approve a list of other things that we want. And then when do we get to then approve the cuts that are supposed to offset those additions? And what if there's a mismatch? And what do we do then? Those things don't seem to make sense in terms of how we're proceeding. So I still think that it would be useful to have a running list that then we come back and say, hey, everything made it in, no problem. We're good with the offsets. We're good with the COVID-19 additional money. Everything is great, versus just being real final without understanding the offsets. So anyway, again,
Thank you. Councilmember Rice.
So I'm going to try and be clear about what my concerns are. And Councilmember Friedson, please know this has nothing to do with you, has nothing to do with your recommendation. This is about process. And I'm a very process-oriented person. And so I feel as though this process needs to be fixed. It's the reason why my comments started off that way. So again, this has nothing to do with you, has nothing to do with your recommendation. This is process. And so for my issue, again, there has not been a clarification as to who owns a cut. And you cannot say the alternatively piece in this process unless you identify that, or else 9 members could identify the same cut and claim credit to that same cut for the multitude of different priorities that they want to say they want to add in that are non-COVID related, right? Because this is all, so outside of the COVID response, which is where we've tried to limit ourselves when it comes to our special appropriations, right? Now we're saying outside of that COVID, if you want to bring something in, you also should therefore then identify cuts. Well, who owns it? Is it the first person who gives it to the council president? Is it the first person who puts it in a memo, who says it publicly, who does whatever? If 2 people say it, if 3 people say it, who gets it? I mean, honestly, Mr. President, you're going to have to tell us this. If we move forward with this vote right now, you're going to have to lay this out, and that's going to be the way it is from now. And I promise you, as Councilmember Jawando said, I mean, I've already sent a memo to my staff and said, I want you to start working on identifying cuts in the budget right now, just in case. I mean, that's what I have to do as a council member, because again, if I see that there are things and priorities, we're about to go to Montgomery College right now in 2 steps. There are things that I'm asking Montgomery College to take out and find in their budget. If now I know all I have to do is just identify where I can find money for this additional thing that was already in their budget, that was already something that's pre-existing, that's a program that they're doing to help underprivileged kids in Montgomery County, I can do that, right? So again, I mean, let's just be real about this. There is no, non-feel-good justification way in which we can identify stuff as a part of this budget that we know we could continue to keep, that would still be continuity of service that we hadn't projected that we may cut. And so that's why I'm saying that, again, I want us to take a pause before we go down this hole, because I promise you it's not going to be good. As a person who's been on this council for a very long time, as a person who's been in elected office for a very long time, I know how this story ends. And I don't want us to go down that road. And again, it has nothing to do with the validity and what we want to do with Councilmember Friedson's initiative. I think it's worthwhile, and it's something that we did make a promise to, but we've got to be very clear about how we're going to limit ourselves in this, because if we open this up the way it currently is drafted, and I've reread your memo multiple times now, the way it's drafted right now, it's wide open, and there's no limitations that are there, and there's no there's nothing explicit about saying, okay, well, I could pick the same revenue that Councilmember Friedson just said and equate it to what I'm talking about, and it would still meet the requirements of your memo. So I just want to put that out there for us to think about, again, as a caution and a pause button to say, maybe we need to take a step back. Let's do the basic stuff, put a pin in this other stuff, and maybe we can come back to it on Thursday and talk about all the addition stuff that we want to add in or something like that. Just putting it out there.
Okay. Councilmember Albornoz.
On a lighter note, I think I'm going to cancel my 5 p.m. Zoom meeting because I don't think we're going to be done by 5 o'clock. We're on item 5 and we've got 30 to get to. So I missed literally 2 minutes because my daughter had a little spill downstairs. So what I miss? I'm kidding. So this has been a very healthy and productive conversation. I just want to make clear that I appreciate and very much respect Councilmember Friedson's taking the initiative to identify potential cuts later on in this discussion, but my support for this specific bill was not predicated on his making that recommendation for those cuts. For me, this is consistent with the continuity of service because it's a process that we had put into motion because of what had happened and transpired prior to COVID, which I think has gotten worse since COVID. And so on this specific item, that's why I was comfortable supporting it from that regard. But I agree that the systemic issues on how or if this specifically connects to recommendations on other cuts to offset items like this is an issue that we have to deal with. And so I do think that's an important part of this discussion, but I just wanted to make clear that my support of this motion was not predicated on Councilmember Friedson's projected reductions that he'd like to recommend later on down the line. So I just wanted to make that distinction, and I agree with a lot of what has been said, and in particular, Councilmember Navarro, with regards to whether this is on a list or not a list, and understand to Councilmember Jawando's point, not wanting to be in a position to have to take something out. I respect that. But in this case, on this specific item, and it could have been any of them, as people have stated, I just supported this on the merits, as I know all of us do in principle, acknowledging that we have this systemic issue that we have to address.
Well, I thank you very much. I'm sorry that no one got back to me on the memo itself, because that could have hopefully have avoided some of this discussion today. I'm not saying that the discussion today wasn't necessary and we needed to have it, but I do believe that would have been some avoidance for this discussion. We wouldn't have had to have all of this discussion. We could have perhaps worked out some of the concern. What I'm going to suggest, and there again, this is a suggestion, is that we take a recess right now, and that I meet with their staff through Zoom or whatever, however we're going to meet, and then after lunch, I'd like to come back at 1 o'clock rather than 1:30. Is that allowed? That we can do that? I'd like to come back at 1 o'clock rather than 1:30 and see, and then start this conversation whether or not we would start with the process before we continue this continuance of this discussion. But bottom line on this, I had concerns about $700,000. I believe that what is necessary, once I heard from read Councilmember Friedson's memo, I thought he did an extremely good job. I think that it is all of us have been supportive of keeping our faith community and all of our communities safe. And I think this goes a long way to do that. And so therefore, to Councilmember Albernaz's point, I'm supportive of this. And I'm also very concerned about $700,000 in a continuity of services budget. I'd like to figure out how we can fit that puzzle together, but I do believe we need to have a public discussion on how we should go forward on this budget so that everyone is aware of all of us, all of our colleagues are aware, as well as the public, on how we're going to achieve this. This is not easy. This is not pretty, but this is necessary. And I think that's what we should do. If it meets with your approval, I'm going to ask for a recess. I see nobody jumping up and down at me. First time all day, that end. Okay. Thank you very much. We are in recess.